We have some sensitive discussions today, so heads up. Many Quebecois do not hire a person because of their color, which by the way is not limited to Quebec. How can you explain this as an economist, and what solutions can you think for it? Just a reminder, saying that they are racist or immoral is not an economic answer, so try to base yourself on what you've learned so far in the course. Pause here, record this slide number, and write down your answers. Remember that in economics, rational does not mean good, does not mean fair, does not mean appropriate, or that it should be done. It's none of that. Rational means calculated, predictable, based on weighing the expected costs and benefits. So we can define rational discrimination as distinction based on productivity. This is not a moral judgment about how much a person is worth, but the expected value of their work. So we want to anchor ourselves in that, because when we have a strong emotional reaction against an issue, we are not likely to understand why it's happening to begin with. We want to suspend our normative impulse and study a behavior without value judgments. And then irrational discrimination would be when two things are treated not based on their productivity, but based on personal bias, prejudice, and bigotry. Now, if you're really caught up in the normative mode, you could say the second type is immoral and shouldn't happen, as opposed to the first. But I'd rather stay within the scope of economics. So here's an example of rational discrimination, and here's an example of irrational discrimination. Notice that the examples are given from your life, and that's where we start. Before we point the finger at others, let's see to what extent we discriminate and why. And the important part here is productivity. That's the determining factor about whether something is rational discrimination or not. So before we take any stand or come up with any solution for discrimination, we need to discriminate between what is justifiable and unjustifiable. Now you might be like, hang on, how much irrational discrimination is out there? Well, we must first isolate the productivity factor, and that's not easy. Just because there's a gap, we can't conclude that there is irrational discrimination. And the more we study human behavior, the more we discover rational patterns. So summarize this slide in your own words and write your own examples for each of the two types. By now you know that the golden market key to any problem is competition. And a competitive market is the free voluntary interaction of self-interested individuals. Now, what's the logic of an employer? What do employers care about? What's their objective? Is to maximize their profit. So here employer A represents a typical profit maximizing firm. They may discriminate rationally while employer B practices irrational discrimination. But remember, there is no free lunch, so B must pay for its preference. The consequence of rational discrimination in a competitive market is that their profits will decrease unless they charge a higher price to their customers or cut off from their quality, both of which make it less competitive and less appealing in the market. So what happens is that the other competitors can drive them out of the business. Oh, that's cool. In a competitive market, the only thing that matters is profitability, as opposed to anything that does not relate to one's productivity. A study actually found that baseball teams which didn't integrate racially lost their games substantially more often than more integrated teams. That's how they paid for their irrational discrimination. It was a cost on the owner and employee. What have they done? So irrational discrimination is really shooting oneself in the foot and digging one's own grave. And that would be a disincentive. So this is the amazing power of the market, how pure self-interest leads to more equity and moral values. It's the invisible hand. Make sure you understand the logic here. It's simple and yet super important. You won't be an economist unless you understand how market incentives work. Let's look at a few cases of rational discrimination and what makes them rational. Female dentists earn about 75% the salary of male dentists. This is super interesting because dentists are self-employed. They can't be paying themselves less. So what's going on? They're earning less not because they're less skilled, but because most patients, for whatever reason, prefer to refer to male dentists. It may be irrational on the side of the patients, but the wage differential in the labor market has a rational explanation. Rational discrimination can also explain why male professional athletes make more than females, because there are more viewers for male sports, and their main source of revenue is advertisements. So here's an example. Most fans who watch basketball in the US are white, but most players are black. So there was this study to test if the viewers prefer watching white players, and they actually do. Replacing one black player with an identical white player generated about 8,000 to 13,000 more fans per season for the team. That's an equally productive white player generating about 20% more revenue for the team. Now, is that rational or irrational? What do you think? For the fans, one could say that it's irrational. But if the team hires the white player in this scenario, it is rational discrimination by the employer because there is a difference of profitability. And these things shouldn't be a surprise because in any society, things like sports, movies, and fashion follow the most common appearance. Another case is that most of us prefer to be around people of our own type, especially in the long run, and to focus on our work. That can be another rational basis for employers' reluctance to hire racial or sexual minorities. Another example is the glass ceiling, which is an unwritten contract preventing women from rising on the corporate ladder. This is also rational because it is not based on pure personal bias, but based on expected value. Diversity in the workplace has its advantages, but it can also be distracting. Again, it's about weighing marginal benefit versus marginal cost. That's why sometimes employers segregate their employees, not because of their qualifications, but because the distraction lowers the employer's profits. So again, it is rational. And these are only sustainable if the majority hops on it, which is a good news because the tastes of people change with the change of demographics, which are quite fluid. Did you see that? It shattered. Here's a very common form of rational discrimination, when we can't learn about the individual, so we treat them based on their group. Does that sound familiar? What is it called when we generalize group characteristics? Stereotyping, which we often use with a negative connotation, but remember, we don't want to get caught up with all these values. Regardless of its moral value, we want to see why it happens. Before going any further, let's get something clear. Stereotyping is very common and all of us do it because we lack the information, because we find ourselves in obscurity. So here's an example. Imagine you're walking to a street at night and you see on the right sidewalk a bunch of young men and on the other side a bunch of older women. Which sidewalk would you take if you had to choose? You don't have access to their criminal record. All you know is that the crime rate of young men is much higher than that of older women. And that's just one example. We literally stereotype every single day in our personal lives. And if we become an employer or police officer, we're going to follow the same rational procedure. Another example is life insurance, which takes into account things that are beyond the control of the person and things that are within the control. What matters either way is to what extent they're going to have an expected cost. In other words, if the goal of a decision is efficiency, then that is rational, regardless of the distinctions that are made, because it's not contemptuous or exploitative. So pause here and summarize this slide in one sentence. This is a super cool concept. Sometimes we rationally choose to remain ignorant. That is when the expected cost of educating oneself is greater than the expected benefit of an informed decision. So here are some examples. Some people choose not to learn a language or not learn math or science. They renounce the benefit of learning because it has a high cost for them. And governments take advantage of this when they levy a tiny poquito tax on something. Overall, it adds to a huge revenue for the government, but each individual doesn't have enough incentive to investigate. Or if your doctor tells you about a fatal disease, you're like, what have you done? Pure cost with no benefit. In voting at the provincial or federal level, most people don't know much about their candidates or even their party. This is a major flaw of democracy. That's why local decision making is much preferred since people have more incentive to participate because the expected benefits are higher. My own example is that I don't follow the news. It doesn't really add to my utility to know about all the awful things that's going in the world or what the celebrity did, and it costs much of my time. Now, here's a scenario. Imagine that group A has 30% alcoholics and group B has 2%. If you had to employ one person and that's all you knew, from which group would you pick? And how would you justify it as an economist? So pause here and write down your argument. A profit-maximizing employer would pick from B because the expected cost of that group is less than the risk of hiring one from A, which means that 70% sober majority in A would pay the cost of the risky minority. Now, is that fair? Well, that goes beyond economics, but we can say that it's rational. There are many other examples for this, like when consumers aren't willing to buy a product from a certain country because other products from that country had a high rate of defect. It's another form of stereotyping, and it is rational. This is why transparency is so important. It's a necessary condition not only for fairness and equity, but also for efficiency. And that is the opportunity cost of emphasizing so much on privacy of personal information. You have no right to know my criminal record. You have no right to know my family background. You have no right to know if I'm an alcoholic. Fine, you can have that, but remember, there is no free lunch. It comes at an expense. When there is a lack of information, rational agents try to find an alternative. And they're likely to fill in the missing values with the wrong data, which only adds to the bias in the results. It's a rational process, and it's not malevolent prejudice, and it results in more disparities in the outcomes. So the more there's a trade-off here, the more privacy there is in the society, the less transparency there will be, which results in a loss of both efficiency and fairness. So take good notes on this concept and write your own example of rational ignorance from your own life. Here's one more example of statistical discrimination, which relates to racial profiling. Whether we like this or not, it occurs. It's a fact. And we want to explore why it happens. What are the forces which give rise to this phenomenon? We are not justifying it morally. We want to understand a social reality. Remember scarcity? The police doesn't have enough resources to search everyone. And purely random checks aren't efficient either. The purpose of the police budget is to prevent and deter crime. So efficiency is to allocate these resources in a way that achieves that objective the most. So here's one example. There is data on crime rate by age. So the police will rationally search the youth more, including the innocent ones who are effectively paying the price of high-risk ones. That's additional cost and deterrence for all youth. The result is youth crime rate is going to decrease because of the disincentive, and the elderly crime rate is going to increase relatively, and we reach an equilibrium between search rates and hit rates of the two groups. There is this common notion that differential search rates are strong evidence of racial bias. Now you can see that it is a fallacy because it does not distinguish between rational and irrational discrimination. And hit rates is how much contraband or illegal activity an officer can catch per group, and that is the determining factor. Nice. Okay, we want to be able to explain the gender wage gap while suspending our emotional reactions and moral judgments, looking at it from a purely rational perspective. So imagine a young couple who know that the expected wage of women is less than men, which is actually true in most sectors, especially in more traditional societies, and that they're equally productive in the home sector. Now you might be like, hang on, women are actually better in the home sector, especially with kids. And that's true. So you can change that line, and it would only reinforce the same result, which is that they face a different opportunity cost, a different relative sacrifice for working at home or in the market. So the husband would be sacrificing greater employment prospects, and that's how they're going to specialize. By the way, specialization and division of labor are specific economic terms. So the wife is going to specialize at home at the expense of her labor participation. Now, what do you think would happen over time? Who is going to grow more in each sector? So what happens is that this is just going to widen their specializations, and it could actually become generational. Now, would you call this systemic discrimination? Or sometimes it's called institutional or structural discrimination. My problem with these terms is that they don't have a clear definition, and those who use them rarely ever define them, and when they do, the definition is so vague that it makes it practically meaningless. This scenario is still a form of rational discrimination because the couple are maximizing their well-being given the prospects they face. They are responding to incentives in a rational way. They could choose otherwise. It's not forced on them. And it's not a hostile top-down subjugation, but the incentives naturally lead them in this direction. Now, the good news is that this is not set in stone. It can change and has been changing. though we must keep in mind that natural bottom-up processes take long. Now, oh, that's so cool. The conclusion is quite important in terms of the rates of return on human capital. That is what determines where and how people invest their resources. So summarize this slide in one sentence using your own words. This slide is quite important since it offers you a different perspective than what you've seen before, a different rhetoric, and it breaks it down for you into small steps. Here's some disturbing facts about certain minorities, especially in the US. Oh, that's cool. When we see these facts, it's natural to be filled with resentment and rage. What a mess. Why is the world so unfair? What do you make of these data? Can we conclude that there is systemic discrimination, that there is some conspiracy of malevolent, evil people holding minorities down? We don't need to resort to conspiracy theories when we can have more straightforward, logical, and convincing explanations. Some counterexamples totally dismantle this systemic hypothesis. So think of these minorities who stand above the average and they haven't been favored by discrimination. If anything, they too have been victims of it, and they haven't been in a position to discriminate against the majority. I have three main problems with the concept of systemic discrimination or systemic racism. One, it doesn't have a clear definition. It's really not informative. Instead, it's rather an expression of resentment and blame. It's a normative statement. Second, it's superficial because it only looks at the symptoms and not the underlying causes. It makes an unjustified leap that if there are disparities in the outcome, then the process must be inherently flawed. Sorry, that doesn't follow. And third, there's certainly individual bias on the personal level, but that doesn't mean that the society as a whole is against some minority group. So it conflates individual bias with social bias. Bottom line, once you dig a little bit deeper, there's no data to support this hypothesis. Now, how do you explain this? You have several minorities who have also been exposed to discrimination, and yet the results are different. We can't jump to the conclusion that any unexplained gap is due to personal bias or employer discrimination when we have clear evidence to our own ignorance. And that's the key, productivity. All it takes is seeing the human capital of Asians, Jews, and immigrants and how much they invest in it. So whenever someone shows you data about the disparity between whites versus some minorities, stop them right there and ask them to also include Asians, Jews, and long-lasting immigrants. After all, they're also part of the minorities in the society. Whatever argument or conclusion they make about systemic racism, it should be able to explain the status of all minorities, not just a couple of them. Otherwise, that's a selection bias. So here's an economic explanation of what quote-unquote systemic discrimination is. And make sure you follow the sequence here. When someone doesn't have a high chance of economic prosperity, they're more likely to engage in crime and drugs because it has a lower sacrifice for them. There isn't any attractive alternatives to keep them away. They'll also find fewer attractive ways to occupy themselves in a meaningful and satisfying way. So they will rationally engage in more drugs and crime. The same is true about those who turn to prostitution, by the way. They don't invest in human capital, and then it's not going to grow. And they won't have better job opportunities, and guess what? Their income doesn't rise or maybe even fall in relative sense. And that becomes a vicious circle. What I want to emphasize here is that this is not forced upon them. Rather, they're making the most rational decision given the expected costs and benefits that they face. They are as intelligent as anyone else. They are simply responding to their circumstances. And the real discrimination is not happening in the labor market, but much before that, in schooling. So pause here and take some good notes. The golden key to deter discriminatory practices is the threat of competitors, and the biggest obstacle to that is barriers to entry. What's common between these items is that they all are top-down interventions which tend to limit competition. They may have good intentions, but they are not effective since they create rigidity in the market. The minimum wage, for instance, is the greatest cause of holding back African Americans in the US from gaining job experience and growing out of poverty. Labor unions also claim benefits on the basis of their power and not productivity. It is competition which rewards productivity rather than personal bias. And labor mobility is when workers can flow from one place to another or from one sector to another, thus providing competitive forces that reduce the returns to discrimination. With greater mobility, greater participation, and greater immigration, there will be more substitutes to the mainstream. And as the demographics change, the current ratios and stereotypes also change. Basically, anything short of human capital is treating the symptoms, and that's the major problem with top-down solutions. So blaming the police, the legal system, or the employers is also addressing the symptoms. If there is systemic racism, it must be sought in education and housing sectors. So these voucher systems and charter schools are amazing and creative ways that push the schools to be more competitive and also reward productivity of the students rather than race. And also the whole culture of empowerment as opposed to victimhood, which we're going to see in a moment. I must also add the element of patience. This is a long-term gradual process. Look at lasting improvements in liberating slaves or emancipating women. They took decades, even centuries, to come about. It takes patience. Almost all government intervention stems from impatience, trying to remove the symptoms quickly, whereas fixing the root causes requires a more natural and bottom-up transition. So summarize this in a sentence in your notes. Victimhood and empowerment are 2 points of view, two approaches to all the inequality in the world. It's not about one being right or wrong, but it's about the priorities we give to each element. It's about focusing on the past or the future, on others or me, on what I lack or what I have, a zero-sum view or a non-zero-sum one, limitation or liberation, protection or growth, inequality or efficiency, external constraints or individual capabilities. Victimhood feeds into a culture of dependence, coercion, blame, envy, and identity. Empowerment cultivates hope, power, choice, gratefulness, and mobility. To be fair, both aspects are realities of human society. The point is not to deny either, but the question is that of emphasis and priority. Remember, economics is about how to allocate our scarce resources, so where would you invest and focus more? What kind of mentality is more constructive? Especially think of education and media, which form the mindset and attitudes of people, both children and adults. Do we want to raise our children in a society where the prevailing culture is that of empowerment or that of victimhood? An example here is how Hitler saw the world versus Gandhi or Dr. Martin Luther King. And these are not direct quotes, by the way. Another example is Cain versus Abel. And here's a book that I strongly recommend you to read with an amazing epigraph. Thus in Cain we glimpse the mindset of a self-professed victim. They invite additional misery with their response, a chronic looking back and blame of others, which sacrifices the future to the past. I hope today's lesson offered you a different perspective than the usual moral argument, not as a substitute to it, but as a complement for it. So here are some exercise questions and try to answer them using the concepts and theories that you learned in today's lesson. And I start by recording this slide number. The best solution to discrimination is competition because it rewards productivity and leads to efficiency. Competition is based on labor mobility and human capital, but it is hampered by barriers to entry such as the minimum wage, trade unions, regulations, and licensure. Competition is also hampered by privacy, which has a trade-off with transparency. And because of that, people will resort to rational ignorance, and that leads to statistical discrimination, also known as stereotyping. And all of that leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy. In this lesson, I would emphasize competition as well as rational ignorance. So pause here and do a concept map by yourself. Try to add or rearrange things and maybe write an example for each of these concepts. Given what you learned today, how would you update your answer to the guiding questions? Take a couple of minutes and jot down. So here's a sample student answer. For the incentives, it could be either rational or irrational behavior, but if it is sustainable, then it must be supported by productivity. Government solutions could be mandates, regulations, and inspections, but they will likely shift our resources away from their most efficient use. And the market-driven alternative would be more competition and more transparency.